In April 1945, the German Eastern Front reached its breaking point. After the Red Army's massive Vistula-Oder offensive earlier that year, Soviet forces had advanced across Poland and positioned themselves along the Oder River, within striking distance of Berlin. The German Ninth Army, commanded by General Theodor Busse, held a central position between the Spreewald region and the Oder Front. Its task was to defend the approaches to the German capital, but in reality it stood isolated, outnumbered, and in danger of encirclement. The broader geopolitical context left little doubt about the stakes. The Third Reich was collapsing under the combined pressure of Allied offensives from both east and west. By April, American and British troops had crossed the Rhine, advancing deep into central Germany, while Soviet forces under Marshals Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konev prepared to launch the Berlin operation. Hitler's insistence on defending every sector, regardless of feasibility, left commanders with little freedom to maneuver. Fortress orders demanded resistance until the last possible moment, even when retreat or withdrawal might have preserved forces for a more effective defense. The Ninth Army numbered around 200,000 men, including regular Wehrmacht divisions, Waffen-SS units, Volkssturm contingents, and remnants of formations shattered in earlier battles. It possessed some armor and artillery, but shortages of fuel, ammunition, and supplies limited mobility and reduced effectiveness. Facing them, the Red Army had deployed elements of the First Ukrainian Front and the First Belarusian Front, together fielding over 1 million troops, thousands of tanks and self-propelled guns, and overwhelming artillery and air support. The strategic geography of Halbe, a small village southeast of Berlin, would soon give its name to the battle. The area lay within a corridor of forests, lakes, and narrow roads, which shaped the possibilities for movement and defense. For the Germans, this terrain offered concealment and the hope of slipping westward to link with German forces along the Elbe and surrender to the Western Allies rather than to the Soviets. For the Soviets, control of the corridor meant sealing the fate of the Ninth Army and preventing any reinforcement or escape from the Berlin pocket. Public sentiment in Germany reflected despair mixed with defiance. Civilians in Brandenburg and surrounding areas were already experiencing the effects of bombardment, refugee movements, and collapsing infrastructure. Propaganda continued to promise salvation through last-minute counteroffensives or political shifts, but few believed such claims. Within the Ninth Army, soldiers knew they faced overwhelming odds, yet discipline and fear of reprisals kept them in their positions. Many hoped that if they could break through westward, survival and captivity under the Americans might still be possible. Soviet intelligence assessments confirmed the vulnerability of the German Ninth Army. Reconnaissance identified concentrations of German troops east of Berlin, and Soviet planners anticipated an attempt to break out once the encirclement tightened. Orders were prepared to intercept any such movement, with artillery and tank formations deployed to block escape routes through Halbe and surrounding villages. Thus, the preconditions of the battle were set. A German army trapped between two Soviet fronts, a desperate command structure under orders to resist, and a civilian population caught in the path of maneuver warfare in the war's final weeks. The destruction of the Ninth Army was not yet certain, but the forces aligned around Halbe made its outcome all but inevitable. The opening phase of the Battle of Halbe began on April 16, 1945, when the Soviets launched the Berlin offensive. The First Belarusian Front under Marshal Zhukov attacked across the Oder at the Sayelo Heights, while Marshal Konev's First Ukrainian Front advanced from the south through Lusatia. These offensives threatened to encircle the German Ninth Army, positioned between Frankfurt and der Oder and Cottbus. General Theodor Busse, commanding the Ninth Army, had approximately 200,000 troops, but they were stretched thin along a wide front with limited armor and artillery and critical shortages of fuel and supplies. As the Soviet advance deepened, the danger became clear. Zhukov's forces pushed directly toward Berlin, while Konev's forces swung northward, aiming to close the ring east of the capital. By April 20th, Soviet units had penetrated deep into Brandenburg, threatening to cut off Busse's army from both Berlin and the Oder. German attempts to counterattack were fragmented and often failed due to overwhelming Soviet superiority in men and materiel. The German High Command, however, insisted on holding positions, hoping to buy time for Berlin's defenses. The encirclement began to form on April 22nd, when Soviet units of the 1st Ukrainian Front, linked with elements of the 1st Belarusian Front near Breakout and Storkow, effectively surrounding the 9th Army and portions of the 4th Panzer Army. What had been a defensive line became a pocket, with German forces trapped in a shrinking area east and southeast of Berlin. Attempts to maintain contact with the capital failed, as Soviet breakthroughs severed communication lines and destroyed supply depots. In response, Busse and his staff sought permission to withdraw westward toward the Elbe River and the approaching American lines. Many officers believed that surrendering to the Western Allies offered the only chance for survival. Hitler, however, forbade any retreat, ordering the 9th Army to turn north and link with General Helmuth Weidling's forces defending Berlin. This directive was unrealistic, as Soviet forces already dominated the terrain and road networks between the pocket and the capital. During this opening phase, the German 9th Army's cohesion began to fray. Units attempted to regroup into defensive clusters, protecting civilians and refugees who had flooded into the forests and villages around Halbe. Columns of wagons, carts, and displaced people slowed movement, making organized maneuvers difficult. Soviet reconnaissance aircraft reported large groups of civilians intermingled with German columns, complicating Soviet targeting but also highlighting the desperation of the retreat. For the Soviets, the first days of encirclement were used to tighten the ring. Tank and mechanized corps advanced along key roads, while artillery and mortars pounded German strongpoints. Airstrikes targeted columns, attempting to move westward, inflicting heavy losses on both troops and civilians. The Soviet aim was not only to crush resistance, but also to prevent any breakout toward the American lines. By 24th April, the 9th Army was effectively trapped, its only options either destruction in place or a breakout attempt through Halbe's forests and villages. The opening phase thus established the framework of the battle. A German army encircled in order to fight against overwhelming odds, Soviet forces determined to prevent escape, and thousands of civilians caught in the middle. What followed would be one of the most violent and costly encirclement battles of the final weeks of the war in Europe. The strategic goals and planning of both sides during the Battle of Halbe were shaped by the larger framework of the Soviet Berlin offensive and the collapsing situation of the German Reich in April 1945. By mid-April, the Red Army had already committed massive forces to break through the Oder-Neisse line and surround Berlin. The German 9th Army, under General Theodor Busse, found itself at the center of this decisive confrontation, while the Soviet command sought to ensure that no German forces could escape westward to prolong the war or surrender to the Western Allies. For the Soviet High Command, Stavka, the principal goal in the region southeast of Berlin was to eliminate the 9th Army and close the southern approaches to the capital. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front and Marshal Ivan Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front had been given overlapping operational objectives that converged near Berlin. While Zhukov's armies pressed westward from the Oder River toward Berlin, Konev's forces moved northward from the Neisse to cut off retreating German units. This overlap created a deliberate competition between Zhukov and Konev, encouraged by Stalin, who wanted to accelerate the capture of Berlin and keep both commanders fully committed. As part of this plan, Konev's 3rd and 4th Guards Tank Armies, supported by the 28th and 13th Armies, advanced rapidly into Brandenburg, seizing key road junctions and forming the encirclement. The Soviet plan relied heavily on numerical superiority and logistical preparation. The 1st Belarusian Front fielded over 900,000 men, supported by around 3,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, 16,000 artillery pieces, and 2,800 aircraft. The 1st Ukrainian Front deployed roughly 750,000 troops, 2,000 tanks, and more than 1,500 aircraft. These forces dwarfed the German 9th Army's manpower of about 200,000 soldiers, of which a significant proportion were Volkssturm units, Hitler Youth, or elements drawn from administrative and rear area troops. German armored reserves were minimal, with perhaps 60 to 80 operational tanks and assault guns, many with insufficient fuel or ammunition. The German High Command, however, pursued a contradictory set of objectives. Adolf Hitler insisted that the Ninth Army hold its ground and attempt to link with General Helmuth Weidling's forces in Berlin, thereby reinforcing the capital's defense. This directive ignored the reality on the ground, where Soviet breakthroughs had already severed most lines of communication. General Busse and Army Group Vistula's commander, General Gotthard Heinrici, recognized the impossibility of this plan. Both argued that the only realistic option was to break westward toward the Elbe River, aiming to surrender to the American forces advancing through central Germany. The German logistical situation was catastrophic. Supplies of fuel and ammunition had been exhausted by weeks of defensive battles on the Oder front. Food stocks were insufficient for the large number of troops and the tens of thousands of civilians who had fled into the Ninth Army zone. Columns of refugees clogged the limited roads, competing with military vehicles for space and slowing movements. Attempts to resupply from Berlin or other German depots were impossible due to Soviet control of key rail lines and highways. Air supply was minimal, as the Luftwaffe had neither the aircraft nor the fuel to sustain large-scale deliveries. On the Soviet side, logistical preparations were immense but strained by the rapid pace of the Berlin offensive. Long supply lines stretched back across the Oder and Neisse rivers, requiring bridging operations and repair of captured infrastructure. Soviet tank armies consumed vast quantities of fuel and ammunition, which had to be transported forward under difficult conditions. Nevertheless, the Red Army had built up stockpiles in advance and relied on superior mobility and engineering units to sustain the offensive. Propaganda played a notable role in the planning stage. German leadership sought to present the Ninth Army's stand as part of a broader defense of the Reich, emphasizing loyalty to Hitler and the defense of Berlin. Nazi propaganda portrayed Soviet forces as a threat to German civilians, thereby encouraging both soldiers and civilians to resist or flee westward. At the same time, Soviet propaganda emphasized the inevitability of German defeat and the necessity of preventing enemy forces from escaping to the Western Allies. Leaflets and broadcasts targeted German troops, urging them to surrender and promising humane treatment, though actual conditions for prisoners varied greatly. The planning also highlighted miscalculations on both sides. The German High Command underestimated the speed and scale of the Soviet encirclement. By focusing on Berlin as the central objective, Hitler ignored the operational reality that the Ninth Army was already isolated. On the Soviet side, the rapid pace of operations sometimes created coordination problems between Zhukov's and Konev's forces. Units advancing from different directions occasionally interfered with each other's movements, and communication between fronts was not always seamless. As April advanced, the Ninth Army became increasingly aware that time was running out. General Busse and his staff, along with other commanders such as General Wilhelm Hasse of the 11th SS Corps, began drafting contingency plans for a westward breakout. The goal was to punch through Soviet lines near Halbe, break across the Spree River, and reach the Elbe. These plans, however, were fraught with risk. The terrain consisted of dense forests, marshy ground, and small villages, which favored Soviet artillery and airstrikes. Moreover, Soviet commanders anticipated such attempts and concentrated forces along likely breakout routes. The strategic situation thus set the stage for the desperate fighting that would follow. The Soviets, with overwhelming numbers and resources, were determined to crush the Ninth Army and secure the approaches to Berlin. The Germans, isolated and poorly supplied, aimed only to escape destruction and reach the Western Allies. Between these two opposing goals stood tens of thousands of civilians, forced to share the fate of the retreating army. The planning on both sides made clear that the coming days would bring not a traditional battle for territory, but a struggle for survival in the forests and villages around Halbe. The first engagements around Halbe began in the third week of April 1945, as Soviet and Polish units tightened the encirclement of the German Ninth Army. The Soviet advance had cut off routes to Berlin, leaving General Theodor Busse's forces trapped in a pocket stretching from Fürstenwalde in the north to Baruth in the south, with Halbe roughly at its center. The area was heavily forested, interspersed with marshes, small rivers, and villages, which influenced the pattern of combat. Unlike the open battles on the Oder front, This stage was dominated by close quarters fighting in woods and urban ruins, where tanks and heavy artillery could not always operate effectively. On 23 April, the Soviet 3rd Guards Tank Army and 28th Army struck the eastern perimeter of the pocket near Storkow and Topitz. German forces of the 11th SS Corps, including remnants of the 32nd SS Volunteer Grenadier Division, 30 January, attempted to hold defensive lines to prevent Soviet armored spearheads from cutting deeper into the pocket. However, Soviet artillery, concentrated in enormous numbers, systematically destroyed German strongpoints. Reports indicate that in some sectors, Soviet divisions deployed more than 150 guns and mortars per kilometer of front, creating zones of devastation through which infantry and tanks advanced. The German response was immediate but fragmented. Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS units, reinforced by Volkssturm battalions and retreating police regiments, counterattacked in localized thrusts to keep escape routes open. These counterattacks were often supported by a handful of Panzer IVs and assault guns, though fuel shortages limited their mobility. At Bestensee and Königs Wusterhausen, German forces mounted night assaults to retake positions lost during the day, achieving temporary success but suffering high casualties in the process. Soviet accounts describe repeated German attempts to break contact and move westward, only to be repelled by artillery fire and counterattacks by Soviet Guards infantry. The civilian presence in the battle zone complicated the early engagements. Thousands of refugees fleeing from Silesia and East Prussia had converged on the forests around Halbe, hoping to reach the Elbe and surrender to the Americans. Many were caught up in German troop movements, clogging roads and making it difficult for units to maneuver. Soviet commanders noted that columns of civilians were often used by retreating German units as cover, intentionally or unintentionally, as troops withdrew along the same routes. This created tragic situations where artillery and airstrikes fell on mixed groups of soldiers and non-combatants. The first turning point in these engagements came when Soviet forces seized vital road junctions. On the 24th of April, the 50th Guards Rifle Division captured Märkisch Buchholz, a small town that controlled access to the Spree crossing. This blocked one of the last organized routes westward. Simultaneously, elements of the Polish First Army closed in from the north, securing the Dom River line and pushing toward Mittenwald. The German Ninth Army, realizing that the encirclement was now complete, concentrated on preparing breakout attempts rather than defending static positions. Within the pocket, discipline began to erode. Units that had already fought on the Oder front were exhausted, many reduced to less than half their authorized strength. The 21st Panzer Division, for example, had only about 40 operational armored vehicles left, many short on fuel. Infantry divisions, such as the 9th Parachute Division and the 344th Infantry Division, were reduced to Kampfgruppen of a few hundred men each. Desertion and fragmentation increased, with soldiers abandoning heavy equipment to move faster through the forests. Command cohesion suffered as telephone lines were destroyed and radio equipment became scarce. Orders often failed to reach frontline units, leaving commanders to improvise based on immediate threats. For the Soviets, the challenge was not only to crush the German breakout attempts, but also to coordinate their own multi-front assault. Zhukov's First Belarusian Front pressed from the north and east, while Konev's First Ukrainian Front advanced from the south. Coordination between these forces was not always smooth. Units from different fronts occasionally converged on the same objectives, creating confusion. Yet the sheer mass of Soviet troops ensured that German attempts to concentrate their forces for a breakthrough encountered immediate and overwhelming resistance. Air operations intensified during these first engagements. The Soviet 16th Air Army conducted continuous ground attack missions, targeting German columns moving westward. Soviet Il-2 Sturmovik aircraft struck roads and bridges, destroying vehicles and scattering troops. The Luftwaffe presence was negligible, with only a few sorties recorded from nearby bases, primarily reconnaissance flights. German troops were largely defenseless against the constant air attacks, which not only inflicted casualties, but also slowed the pace of movement. Casualty figures from these initial battles are difficult to establish with precision, but estimates suggest that between 23rd and 25th April, the German Ninth Army may have lost up to 20,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured. Soviet forces also suffered losses, particularly in assaults on fortified villages and forested areas where German defenders used terrain to their advantage. In some cases, Soviet rifle divisions advancing through wooded terrain sustained hundreds of casualties in a single day from ambushes and prepared positions. The morale of the German troops varied widely. Some units, particularly Waffen SS formations, continued to resist fiercely, launching counterattacks even when encircled. Others, composed of poorly trained Volkssturm and Hitler Youth, disintegrated under fire, abandoning weapons or surrendering in groups. Civilians in the pocket were increasingly desperate, lacking food, medical supplies, and shelter from constant bombardment. Reports describe overcrowded cellars and improvised camps in the forests, where both soldiers and refugees huddled together under artillery fire. By 25th April, it was clear to both sides that the battle had entered a decisive phase. The German Ninth Army, trapped in the shrinking Halbe pocket, faced annihilation unless a breakout could be achieved. The Soviets, determined to prevent any escape, reinforced their lines with additional rifle corps and artillery units, creating successive layers of defense west of Halbe. What had begun as a series of engagements on the periphery was evolving into one of the most desperate encirclement battles of the war's final weeks. The forests and villages of Halbe became the stage for a brutal struggle where survival, rather than territorial control, was the immediate objective for tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians. As the fighting around Halbe intensified, the battle entered a phase of escalation and crisis. By the end of April 25th, the German Ninth Army found itself almost entirely encircled, compressed into an area roughly 20 kilometers across, with Halbe at the center. The density of troops, equipment, and civilians within this pocket reached extreme levels. An estimated 80,000 to 100,000 German soldiers, along with tens of thousands of refugees, were concentrated in the woods, villages, and roads south of Berlin. Their sole objective was to force a corridor westward to link with General Walter Wenck's 12th Army, which had begun moving east from the Elbe in an effort to relieve pressure on Berlin. The Soviet command recognized the strategic significance of this attempt. If Buse's 9th Army managed to break through and join with Wenck, a substantial force could have been reconstituted on the western bank of the Elbe, complicating the Soviet drive toward Berlin and potentially slowing the war's conclusion. Thus, Zhukov and Konev allocated massive resources to ensure the destruction of the pocket. The 1st Ukrainian Front deployed elements of the 3rd Guards Tank Army, the 28th Army, and the 13th Army to seal the southern perimeter. From the north and east, the 1st Belarusian Front pressed with the 69th Army and the 33rd Army. Additional artillery and aviation assets were concentrated to block the routes west. The crisis deepened as German commanders debated the timing and direction of their breakout attempts. General Buse initially ordered his forces to move northwest toward Zosin and Bielitz, but Soviet penetrations forced repeated changes in direction. Each adjustment fragmented German formations further, as units lost cohesion in the chaos of forest battles. 11 SS Corps, commanded by Matthias Kleinheister-Kamp, became a central element of the breakout attempts. His corps included remnants of several divisions, among them the 32nd SS Division 30 January and the 11th SS Volunteer Panzergrenadier Division Nordland, as well as elements of regular Wehrmacht infantry. These units attempted to spearhead the westward thrusts, but their strength was heavily depleted. The scale of Soviet firepower during this phase cannot be overstated. Artillery concentrations reached unprecedented levels, with some estimates suggesting more than 20,000 guns and mortars in action across the entire encirclement front. Soviet commanders used a moving wall of artillery fire, advancing in barrages of shells to precede infantry movements. Villages such as Markisch Buchholz, Baruth, and Halbe itself were systematically shelled until little remained but ruins. Forests were set ablaze, creating both physical barriers and suffocating conditions for those trapped inside. German accounts describe entire columns being annihilated in minutes by a concentrated fire as they attempted to move along narrow forest paths. Air attacks intensified the crisis. The Soviet 16th Air Army launched continuous sorties with Il-2 ground attack aircraft, Yak fighters, and P-2 bombers. Their targets were columns of vehicles, river crossings, and assembly areas within the pocket. Ammunition wagons and fuel depots were hit repeatedly, igniting massive fires. With the Luftwaffe nearly absent, German troops had no effective protection against these strikes. The few remaining German fighter aircraft operating from nearby airfields were quickly overwhelmed. German forces, despite their dire situation, launched determined attempts to break through. On April 26th, a major effort began, with multiple divisions advancing toward the west, in an attempt to reach the Spree crossings near Köpenick and Königs Wusterhausen. Thousands of troops surged forward in tightly packed columns, often mingling with refugees and horse-drawn carts. Soviet defenses responded with layered firepower. Machine guns, mortars, and anti-tank weapons decimated the front ranks, while artillery cut off the rear. Soviet units reported capturing large numbers of German soldiers, many too exhausted to continue fighting. Yet others fought with desperation, using Panzerfausts and grenades in close combat against Soviet armor. The humanitarian crisis reached a peak during this escalation. Refugee columns were caught in the crossfire, with civilians perishing in large numbers. Soviet reports noted that women, children, and elderly people were intermingled with military formations, making it nearly impossible to separate non-combatants from soldiers. Medical facilities within the pocket collapsed under the strain. Field hospitals were overwhelmed, and supplies of morphine, bandages, and food were exhausted. Doctors resorted to rudimentary methods, performing amputations without anesthetics. Many wounded were abandoned in forest clearings or village ruins, unable to move as the retreat surged westward. Political tensions also played a role in this phase of the battle. The German High Command in Berlin issued contradictory orders, demanding both the defense of positions to delay Soviet advances and simultaneous breakouts to the west. Hitler's insistence on holding ground conflicted with the urgent need to escape encirclement. General Heinrici, commander of Army Group Vestula, argued for a concentrated breakout, but his authority was limited by Hitler's direct interference and by the disintegration of communications between Berlin and frontline commanders. The result was confusion, with units attempting to follow conflicting directives in rapidly changing conditions. Soviet leadership faced its own challenges. While the destruction of the German Ninth Army was a clear goal, the priority remained the capture of Berlin. Zhukov and Konev had to balance the allocation of forces between the Halbe pocket and the final assault on the German capital. Some Soviet commanders pressed for a rapid annihilation of Buse's army to prevent it from interfering with the Berlin operation, while others sought to conserve forces for the climactic battles in the city. This tension influenced the pace and direction of Soviet offensives around Halbe. The scale of casualties during this escalation was immense. Estimates suggest that by the end of April 27th, the German Ninth Army had lost between 40,000 and 50,000 men, either killed, wounded, or captured. Soviet losses were also considerable, with divisions engaged in forest fighting reporting thousands of casualties. The intensity of combat, combined with the density of troops in confined terrain, produced one of the bloodiest encirclement battles of the war's final weeks. Despite these losses, German troops continued to attempt breakouts. Small groups succeeded in slipping through gaps in Soviet lines, particularly at night. However, these were exceptions rather than the rule. Most columns were shattered before reaching open ground. Survivors who managed to escape often did so without heavy equipment, abandoning vehicles, artillery, and even small arms. This meant that even successful breakout groups arrived at the Elbe in a severely weakened state, unable to influence the larger course of the war. By April 28th, the crisis had reached its peak. The Halbe pocket was reduced to less than 10 kilometers across, with Halbe itself becoming the epicenter of destruction. Soviet forces pressed from all directions, while German survivors attempted one final surge westward. The forests were filled with the sounds of constant artillery fire, small arms clashes, and the cries of wounded men and civilians. The destruction of the German Ninth Army was no longer a matter of strategy, but of time. The escalation phase of the battle had transformed the region into a killing ground, where entire formations were annihilated in the struggle for survival. The peak of the Battle of Halbe came between 28th and 30th April 1945, when the German Ninth Army made its largest and most desperate efforts to break out of the Soviet encirclement. By this stage, the pocket had been compressed into an area of only a few square kilometers, with Halbe village at its center. Inside were remnants of more than 20 divisions, reduced by weeks of attrition to fragmented Kampfgruppen, mixed with tens of thousands of civilians and auxiliary units. Estimates put the total number of people in the pocket at 80,000 to 100,000, including soldiers, Volkssturm detachments, Hitler Youth, refugees, and displaced persons. Against them stood elements of the 1st Belarusian and 1st Ukrainian fronts, numbering more than 250,000 troops, reinforced by artillery groupings and armored corps tasked with sealing the encirclement. The German command concentrated on a single objective: reaching the western bank of the Elbe to surrender to American forces. This meant pushing westward through the Soviet ring at its weakest points. General Busey ordered coordinated attacks with the remnants of the 11th SS Corps, the 5th Army Corps, and panzer units from the 21st Panzer Division. The intention was to break through Soviet lines near Märkisch-Buchholz, cross the Spree River, and then link up with Wenck's 12th Army, advancing from the west. However, the execution of this plan was chaotic. Soviet forces had already identified likely breakout routes and fortified them with overlapping zones of artillery, minefields, and tank units. The breakout attempts of April 28th began before dawn. Entire divisions surged forward in compact columns, using darkness and forest cover for concealment. Infantry, tanks, and horse-drawn wagons moved along narrow woodland tracks, accompanied by thousands of civilians. As soon as the columns reached open ground, they were engaged by Soviet artillery batteries. The Soviets fired pre-registered barrages, saturating likely crossing points with shells. The density of fire was such that entire battalions were destroyed in minutes. Survivors tried to reorganize, but repeated Soviet counterattacks by infantry and mechanized units forced them back into the forests. Halbe village itself became the focal point of some of the most intense fighting. Soviet divisions of the 3rd Guards Tank Army and the 28th Army surrounded the settlement, reducing it with artillery and close-quarters infantry assaults. German units defending the village used every available structure as a strong point, fighting from cellars, barns, and church ruins. Combat often devolved into hand-to-hand engagements, with Soviet infantry clearing houses one by one. By the end of 29th April, Halbe was largely destroyed, its streets filled with wrecked vehicles and casualties from both sides. The ruins of the village became a symbol of the annihilation of the Ninth Army. Civilians trapped in the pocket faced catastrophic conditions. Refugee columns attempting to follow German troops were caught in crossfires and bombardments. Soviet artillery did not distinguish between military and civilian targets, and eyewitness accounts describe horrific scenes of carts laden with belongings overturned, families killed alongside soldiers, and forests littered with bodies. Food supplies were gone, and drinking water was often contaminated by nearby fighting. Civilians who attempted to surrender separately to Soviet troops faced uncertain outcomes. Some were escorted away, while others disappeared in the chaos. German medical services had collapsed by this point. Field hospitals were overwhelmed, and many doctors were killed in bombardments. Improvised aid stations in barns and cellars ran out of supplies, forcing amputations and other surgeries without anesthesia. Large numbers of wounded were abandoned as breakout attempts accelerated, with comrades forced to leave them behind in order to move more quickly through Soviet fire. The psychological strain of abandoning fellow soldiers added to the disintegration of morale. Soviet commanders coordinated their efforts with precision. Artillery regiments were shifted constantly to choke points, while tank brigades patrolled roads and villages to intercept any columns that broke through. The Soviet 50th Army and 3rd Guards Tank Army bore much of the fighting, while the 28th Army sealed the southern exits. The Red Army's ability to rotate fresh units into combat ensured constant pressure on the encircled Germans. Soviet reports noted that German breakout attempts were determined but increasingly disorganized, with many small groups fleeing westward without coordination. Nevertheless, the Germans achieved limited successes. Several thousand men managed to break through Soviet lines in scattered groups, often at night. Some reached Wonk's 12th Army near Baylitz or crossed the Elbe to surrender to American forces. However, these were exceptions. The majority of troops were destroyed or captured within the pocket. German estimates later suggested that of the 80,000 to 100,000 men encircled, only 25,000 to 30,000 reached Western lines, and often without equipment. Soviet figures claim that more than 60,000 Germans were killed or captured during the battle's peak days. For the Soviet troops, the battle was also costly. Units engaged in forest fighting reported heavy casualties, as German soldiers fought with desperation, using Panzerfausts and ambush tactics against tanks. Soviet losses in killed and wounded during the Halbe battle are estimated at 20,000 to 25,000, though precise numbers vary between sources. The nature of combat in dense forests, where visibility was limited and front lines constantly shifted, contributed to these high figures. By 30th April, the Ninth Army was shattered. Organized resistance collapsed, with most units either destroyed, surrendered, or reduced to small groups attempting to escape on their own. Soviet forces had achieved their goal, the elimination of a major German field army east of Berlin. At the same time, the outcome of the battle had significant consequences for Berlin itself. With Buse's Ninth Army destroyed, there was no possibility of it linking with Wenck's 12th Army to relieve the capital. Berlin was left isolated, surrounded, and doomed to fall within days. The peak of the battle at Halbe thus represented not only the destruction of a German field army, but also the final collapse of German hopes for prolonging resistance around Berlin. The fighting demonstrated the scale of violence in the war's last weeks. Immense concentrations of artillery and armor, chaotic clashes of soldiers and civilians, and losses measured in tens of thousands within a matter of days. In the forests and villages of Halbe, the fate of the Ninth Army was sealed, marking one of the most destructive encirclement battles of the Second World War's closing chapter. The period following the peak of combat at Halbe did not mark an immediate end to the struggle. Instead, it entered a phase defined by resistance and adaptation, where the remnants of the German Ninth Army and accompanying civilians sought survival in conditions of near-total collapse. Between 30th April and 1st May 1945, the forested region south of Berlin became a chaotic battleground of scattered German detachments, Soviet blocking positions, and desperate attempts to evade annihilation. By this time, the German command structure had disintegrated. General Theodor Buse could issue orders, but the capacity to enforce them was gone. Radio communications with higher headquarters were severed, couriers often killed en route, and staff officers unable to maintain coordination between shattered divisions. Units acted independently, forming ad hoc groups led by surviving officers or even senior NCOs. 11 SS Corps under General Klein-Heisterkamp, though badly mauled, attempted to organize a coordinated withdrawal toward the west. But the Corps commander himself was captured on April 29th, depriving these formations of central leadership. German adaptation during this phase relied on small unit tactics suited to the terrain. Soldiers moved in groups of 20 to 50, using the dense pine forests and undergrowth for concealment. They abandoned heavy equipment, including artillery and most vehicles, which could not move through the terrain without drawing fire. Infantry carried only what they could manage: rifles, Panzerfausts, and limited ammunition. Some troops scavenged supplies from abandoned wagons or the dead. Movement was primarily nocturnal, with groups attempting to bypass Soviet blocking positions under cover of darkness. Daylight hours were spent hiding in thickets, cellars of ruined villages, or trenches hastily dug in forest clearings. For civilians caught in the pocket, adaptation took on even harsher forms. Refugee families often attached themselves to military groups for protection, though this exposed them to Soviet fire. Others tried to scatter into the forests, hoping to survive by avoiding combat entirely. Local villagers faced impossible choices. Sheltering fugitives could provoke Soviet reprisals, but turning them away left them to near certain death. Some accounts record villagers offering food or water in secret, while others closed doors for fear of being accused of collaboration. The psychological toll on German soldiers was immense. Survivors later described a sense of being hunted, with Soviet artillery and patrols constantly closing in. Encircled troops had to abandon comrades who were wounded and could not keep pace. The act of leaving behind the injured created lasting trauma, yet there was no alternative if groups were to retain mobility. Morale varied. Some units fought with desperation to carve a path west, while others simply dissolved into groups of individuals seeking to survive. Soviet forces adapted as well. Recognizing that the German pocket was collapsing into smaller fragments, Soviet commanders shifted tactics from massed artillery barrages to systematic mopping-up operations. Rifle divisions combed the forests and skirmish lines, supported by light armor and artillery. Cavalry and mechanized units patrolled roads to intercept escape attempts. Aircraft continued to attack concentrations of men and vehicles when discovered, though the density of trees limited effectiveness. Soviet reports indicate that blocking positions were established at major river crossings and road junctions, forcing fugitives into predictable routes where they could be intercepted. Resistance was not only physical, but also organizational. Certain German units attempted to maintain cohesion despite devastation. Elements of the 21st Panzer Division, though stripped of tanks, organized infantry spearheads that managed to break through local Soviet lines for brief periods. Kampfgruppen, formed around surviving officers of the 502nd SS Heavy Panzer Battalion, used their knowledge of terrain and experience in delaying tactics to shield refugee groups. These efforts bought time for some columns to advance several kilometers before being cut off again. By May 1st, German resistance had fractured into a series of localized battles. At Halbe itself, the ruins of the village and surrounding woods were littered with destroyed vehicles, dead animals, and bodies of soldiers and civilians. To the west, near the Spree crossings, Soviet accounts described fields covered with wreckage from repeated German assaults. In places where Germans penetrated Soviet lines, counterattacks rapidly sealed the breaches. Yet, despite these obstacles, groups continued to slip through. The Soviets acknowledged that the density of the forests made it impossible to prevent every escape. The numbers illustrate both the scale of destruction and the resilience of those attempting to survive. Of the original 80,000 to 100,000 trapped, estimates suggest that 20,000 to 30,000 reached the Elbe or surrendered to American forces after breaking out in small groups. This meant that even as the Ninth Army ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force, thousands of individuals still managed to evade total destruction. Their survival was the result of adaptation, abandoning conventional tactics, dissolving into the terrain, and prioritizing movement over combat. The cost of resistance was enormous. Soviet records indicate that during the final days of April and early May, tens of thousands of German soldiers were killed or captured. Civilian losses remain incalculable, but entire refugee columns were annihilated in the crossfire. Soviet casualties during the mop-up phase were also significant, though lower than during the earlier massed battles. Units engaged in close combat in forests still suffered heavy losses from ambushes and Panzerfaust attacks, reflecting the danger of underestimating small, desperate groups. Adaptation was not limited to tactics. German soldiers displayed improvisation in survival methods. Some donned civilian clothes to blend with refugees. Others discarded weapons and attempted to surrender singly or in small groups to Soviet patrols, hoping for leniency. A number of accounts describe soldiers splitting into even smaller groups, 4 or 5 men, moving independently, increasing their chances of slipping through gaps. In contrast, larger formations became obvious targets for Soviet firepower. For the Soviets, adaptation meant balancing priorities. While destroying the Ninth Army remained important, the primary strategic goal was securing Berlin, where fighting still raged until May 2nd. Commanders sought to conclude the Halbe battle without diverting excessive resources from the capital. This led to the reliance on encirclement tactics, blockades, and the use of second-line divisions to contain survivors, while elite formations continued their advance into central Berlin. The resistance and adaptation phase revealed the transformation of a regular army into a mass of fugitives. The Ninth Army, once a structured formation with corps and divisions, now existed only as fragmented bands. Yet within this collapse lay a paradox. Resistance continued in isolated pockets, prolonging combat even when the broader outcome was beyond doubt. Adaptation allowed some to survive, but it also prolonged suffering as smaller groups fought futile battles in forests and villages already devastated by artillery fire. By early May, the process of annihilation was nearly complete. Soviet forces closed the last gaps, capturing thousands near Halbe, Märkisch Buchholz, and Baruth. Resistance faded into scattered skirmishes, and adaptation shifted from breakout attempts to survival as prisoners of war or as refugees attempting to avoid capture. The destruction of the Ninth Army was nearly absolute, yet the determination of those within the pocket ensured that the struggle continued longer than Soviet commanders anticipated. The turning point of the Battle of Halbe was not marked by a single engagement, but by a series of events between the 1st and 2nd of May 1945 that transformed the struggle from an organized breakout attempt into the dissolution of the German Ninth Army. By this stage, the pocket had been reduced to a fraction of its original size. The forested area south of Berlin, once holding close to 100,000 troops and tens of thousands of civilians, now contained only scattered groups clinging to the hope of reaching the Elbe River and surrendering to American forces. The most decisive element of this turning point was the collapse of cohesion among German units. General Busse, still nominally in command, had lost the ability to direct the battle. Orders to coordinate with General Wenck's 12th Army were no longer feasible. Wenck himself, advancing eastward from the Elbe, was halted by Soviet forces near Balitz and Potsdam and could not reach the Ninth Army. Communications between Busse and Wenck ceased altogether, and with Berlin already surrounded and falling, no relief was possible. For the Ninth Army, this meant that every breakout attempt was essentially undertaken in isolation, with no hope of linking up with a larger German force. The most significant German effort during this period came on May 1st, when remnants of 11th SS Corps and 5th Army Corps launched a coordinated push westward from Halbe toward the Spree crossings near Märkisch Buchholz. The attack included thousands of soldiers, accompanied by columns of civilians and vehicles. The Germans attempted to concentrate their remaining tanks and assault guns to spearhead the thrust. Soviet forces anticipated this movement. The 50th Army and 3rd Guards Tank Army established strong defensive lines, supported by artillery and air support. When the German columns emerged from the forests, they were met by intense fire. Soviet accounts describe artillery batteries firing continuously for hours, turning roads into killing grounds. Infantry who attempted to follow tanks were cut down, and many civilians in the column were caught in the bombardment. Despite catastrophic losses, fragments of the breakout succeeded in breaching Soviet lines temporarily. Groups of several hundred soldiers at a time crossed the Spree in the chaos, leaving behind wrecked vehicles and thousands of dead. These groups, however, lacked the strength to push much further. Soviet counterattacks quickly sealed the gaps, cutting off the majority of the attacking force. Estimates suggest that only a few thousand men escaped westward during this push, compared to tens of thousands destroyed or captured. This marked the last large-scale attempt by the Ninth Army to break free. The collapse of German resistance after May 1st was accelerated by exhaustion and loss of leadership. Key officers were killed, captured, or simply unable to command scattered remnants. 11 SS Corps had already lost its commander, Klein Heisterkamp, days earlier. The 21st Panzer Division, once a cornerstone of the German defense, ceased to exist as an organized formation. Many units broke into small groups of 20 to 50 men, moving independently and avoiding combat whenever possible. These groups no longer had operational objectives, but focused solely on reaching the Elbe or surrendering to Soviet patrols. The Soviets recognized that the battle was nearing its conclusion. Rather than concentrating artillery and massive barrages, they shifted to systematic sweeps of forests and villages. Rifle divisions advanced in lines, supported by tanks and cavalry patrols. Soviet aircraft hunted for large groups attempting to move west, though the density of forest limited their effectiveness. Soviet commanders reported capturing thousands of prisoners in mopping up operations on the 1st and 2nd of May. Many were demoralized and surrendered without a fight, though others resisted fiercely in local clashes, inflicting casualties with Panzerfausts and ambushes before being overwhelmed. Civilians faced the same turning point as soldiers. Columns that had followed German troops westward were decimated. By May 2nd, most were scattered, hiding in forests, or captured by Soviet forces. Conditions for civilians deteriorated further as food supplies vanished and medical aid was non-existent. Many sought to surrender directly to Soviet soldiers, though outcomes varied. Some were escorted away, while others perished in crossfire or reprisals. The mass flight of civilians through Halbe's forests thus ended in tragedy for most, with only a minority reaching safety to the west. The numbers underline the scale of destruction. Of the estimated 80,000 to 100,000 German soldiers encircled at the beginning of the battle, roughly 25,000 to 30,000 managed to break through in small groups to surrender to American forces. 60,000 were killed or captured in the pocket. Civilian casualties are difficult to estimate, but numbered in the tens of thousands. Soviet losses during the turning point phase were also significant. Units engaged in close fighting reported hundreds of dead and wounded daily, as German troops continued to resist in small-scale clashes. Soviet casualty estimates for the entire Halbe battle range from 20,000 to 25,000 killed and wounded. The turning point also coincided with broader events. On May 2nd, Berlin itself capitulated after days of street fighting. The collapse of the German capital eliminated any strategic purpose for the Ninth Army's continued resistance. News of Berlin's fall filtered into the pocket, further destroying morale. For German soldiers, the realization that the war was effectively lost meant that breakout attempts became individual decisions rather than coordinated military actions. Some surrendered immediately to Soviet troops. Others continued to fight their way west in small detachments, clinging to the possibility of reaching American lines. This phase of the battle demonstrates the transition from organized army-level combat to a chaotic struggle for survival. The German Ninth Army, once a force of nearly 200,000 in April, ceased to exist as a coherent entity. The Soviet encirclement had succeeded in annihilating one of the last major German formations east of Berlin. The turning point was not a sudden event, but the culmination of exhaustion, attrition, and encirclement tactics that left the Germans with no realistic options. By the night of May 2nd, the Battle of Halbe was effectively decided. Thousands of Germans still remained in the forests, attempting to hide or escape, but their fate was sealed. Soviet patrols and blocking units methodically reduced the remaining groups, while those who managed to escape westward arrived without weapons or equipment, surrendering to American forces as exhausted fugitives. The destruction of the Ninth Army had been completed, and the Halbe battle entered its final phase, the aftermath of annihilation and surrender. The aftermath of the Battle of Halbe unfolded between 2 and 4 May 1945, as the remnants of the German Ninth Army either surrendered, were destroyed, or in rare cases succeeded in slipping westward. What began as an organized formation of more than 80,000 to 100,000 troops ended as scattered groups of fugitives, stripped of heavy weapons, supplies, and cohesion. The final days of combat turned the forests and villages around Halbe into a landscape of devastation that bore witness to one of the most destructive encirclement battles of the war's closing chapter. The withdrawal phase was not orderly. German groups that had survived the peak breakout attempts of 28th to 30th April now fragmented into small clusters, numbering between 10 and 50 men. Many carried wounded comrades on makeshift stretchers, though most were forced to abandon those too injured to move. The majority had no artillery, few functioning vehicles, and only limited ammunition. Even food had run out. The priority was speed and concealment rather than combat. Units avoided Soviet positions when possible, choosing routes through dense forests, swamps, or ruined villages. The sight of burned wagons, dead animals, and bodies along these paths testified to earlier failed breakout attempts. For civilians, the withdrawal became a nightmare of attrition. Refugee families who had followed German columns westward were now scattered. Many hid in forest clearings, hoping to avoid combat altogether. But Soviet patrols systematically combed these areas. Women, children, and elderly people perished in large numbers during artillery barrages or air attacks, on columns mistakenly identified as military groups. Soviet reports noted capturing thousands of civilians along with soldiers, creating logistical challenges for transporting and processing such numbers. Civilians who attempted to surrender often faced the same treatment as combatants, at least initially, until they could be separated. On May 2nd, as Berlin officially surrendered, news of the capital's fall reached the remnants of the Ninth Army. Morale collapsed completely. For many German soldiers, the surrender of Berlin meant that any further resistance was futile. Groups began surrendering en masse to Soviet units, particularly those too exhausted to continue marching west. Soviet divisions recorded the capture of tens of thousands of prisoners during these days. Columns of defeated soldiers were escorted to makeshift collection points, where they were stripped of weapons and marched eastward under guard. Conditions in these improvised prisoner camps were dire. Little food or water was available, medical care was non-existent, and many wounded died shortly after capture. At the same time, some groups still attempted breakouts toward the Elbe River, hoping to reach American lines. These efforts were increasingly desperate and often conducted by small detachments of experienced soldiers, sometimes supported by remnants of armored vehicles. A few succeeded. Estimates suggest that between 25,000 and 30,000 German troops from the Halbe pocket ultimately reached American positions on the Elbe, where they surrendered. However, these numbers included only a fraction of the original encircled force, and most had abandoned all equipment along the way. Those who reached American lines often did so in ragged condition, starving, wounded, and carrying only personal weapons. The majority of German forces, however, were destroyed or captured by the Soviets. Soviet records claim that approximately 60,000 German soldiers were killed or taken prisoner in the Halbe pocket. German estimates are similar, though the exact figures remain debated. What is clear is that entire divisions ceased to exist. The 21st Panzer Division, the 502nd SS Heavy Panzer Battalion, and several infantry divisions were annihilated. 11 SS Corps, once central to the breakout effort, was effectively dissolved. For the Wehrmacht, the destruction of the Ninth Army represented the loss of one of its last significant formations on the Eastern Front. Soviet forces also bore heavy costs in the aftermath. Clearing operations through forests and villages remained dangerous, as small German groups continued ambushes. Soviet patrols advancing through Halbe's forests encountered Panzerfaust attacks at close range. Fighting often ended with the total destruction of the German group, but not before Soviet units suffered casualties. Soviet losses during the entire Halbe battle are estimated at 20,000 to 25,000 killed and wounded. This meant that even in victory, the Red Army paid a high price for destroying the Ninth Army. The humanitarian consequences were severe. Civilians who survived the battle emerged to find their villages destroyed. Halbe itself was reduced to rubble, with few intact buildings. Fields and forests were filled with corpses of soldiers and civilians alike. Burial details struggled to cope with the scale of death. In some areas, bodies lay unburied for weeks. Refugees who had survived bombardments faced forced relocation, with many sent eastward into Soviet-controlled territories. Others were absorbed into the streams of displaced persons flooding post-war Germany. The aftermath also created logistical challenges for the Soviets. Tens of thousands of prisoners had to be transported, guarded, and fed, stretching Soviet resources already focused on consolidating control over Berlin and continuing the advance into northern and southern Germany. Many German prisoners were marched eastward on foot, beginning long journeys to internment camps in the Soviet Union. Mortality during these marches was high, particularly among the wounded and malnourished. From a military perspective, the destruction of the Ninth Army eliminated any German capacity to stabilize the front south of Berlin. Without Buse's army, there was no possibility of linking with Wenck's 12th Army or creating a defensive line along the Elbe. The road to American and Soviet occupation zones lay open. Strategically, Halbe removed one of the last organized German field armies in the east, ensuring that remaining resistance in Berlin and its surroundings would collapse quickly. For those trapped in the pocket, the aftermath was personal devastation. Survivors recalled the forests filled with the smell of burned vehicles and decomposing bodies, the cries of wounded left behind, and the silence that followed once the firing ceased. Soldiers who surrendered often expressed relief, though their future as prisoners remained uncertain. Civilians emerged from hiding to ruins and uncertainty. The once dense forests of Brandenburg became a graveyard for tens of thousands, a stark symbol of the final destruction of Nazi Germany's Eastern armies. By May 4th, the battle was effectively over. The pocket no longer existed as a coherent entity. Soviet forces had completed their mopping-up operations, capturing the last stragglers. A few survivors continued to filter westward for several more days, but these were isolated individuals rather than organized groups. The Battle of Halbe had ended with the near-total destruction of the Ninth Army, marking one of the bloodiest encirclement battles in the final weeks of the Second World War. The legacy of the Battle of Halbe is defined by its dual significance as both a military event and a humanitarian catastrophe. From a purely operational perspective, the destruction of the German Ninth Army in late April and early May 1945 removed the last major obstacle to Soviet dominance in Brandenburg and southern Berlin. It eliminated any chance of forming a coherent German defensive line east of the Elbe. With 60,000 to 70,000 German troops killed or captured, and only 25,000 to 30,000 reaching the American lines, the Wehrmacht lost its final organized field formation on the Eastern Front. This accelerated the fall of Berlin, which capitulated on May 2nd, and ensured that Germany's surrender, signed on May 8th, would come without conditions of prolonged resistance. Strategically, Halbe demonstrated the effectiveness of Soviet encirclement tactics in the final stage of the war. The Red Army combined artillery concentrations, mechanized blocking forces, and systematic forest clearing operations to annihilate an enemy army in difficult terrain. It also illustrated the Soviet leadership's determination to prevent German forces from surrendering to the Western Allies. The tight Soviet grip on Brandenburg denied the Germans the possibility of creating a corridor to the Elbe, ensuring that the bulk of the Ninth Army's men fell into Soviet rather than American hands. For the post-war balance of power, this mattered greatly. It provided the Soviet Union with tens of thousands of additional prisoners of war, many of whom would be transported east and held for years. On the German side, the battle epitomized the collapse of command and control in the Reich's final weeks. Orders from Hitler to turn north toward Berlin were impossible to execute, yet defied the reality of Soviet encirclement. Buss's attempts to save his men by breaking west were thwarted not only by Soviet strength, but by the fragmentation of his formations and the exhaustion of his troops. The Ninth Army ceased to exist as a military entity, and its destruction is often cited by historians as a symbol of the futility of Germany's final military efforts in 1945. For civilians, Halbe left scars that lasted for decades. The forests around the village became mass graves, with thousands of bodies buried hastily or left unburied for weeks. Local communities were overwhelmed by the task of clearing battle debris and burying the dead. In post-war East Germany, memorials were erected to commemorate both Soviet and German losses, though the narrative emphasized Soviet sacrifice. Civilian suffering received less attention in official accounts, yet oral histories preserved the memory of refugee families annihilated in artillery fire and of villages destroyed in crossfire. The battle also shaped post-war historical debates. In West Germany, Halbe was remembered primarily as a tragedy of annihilation, where tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians perished in a futile attempt to escape. In East Germany, it was framed as a victory of the Red Army that helped secure the fall of Berlin. In Russia, Halbe remains studied as an example of encirclement warfare successfully executed in the final push to end the war. Modern historiography attempts to balance these perspectives, emphasizing both the operational significance and the immense human cost. Today, the forests around Halbe still bear traces of the battle. War cemeteries contain tens of thousands of graves, and memorial stones mark sites of heavy fighting. Archaeological work and battlefield surveys continue to uncover remains and artifacts, underlining the scale of destruction that occurred in such a concentrated area. For historians, the battle is often described as one of the bloodiest encirclements of the war's final months, alongside the fighting in Breslau and Königsberg. In the long-term perspective, the Battle of Halbe represents the futility of Germany's last military efforts and the determination of the Soviet Union to complete its encirclement strategy. It ensured that the Ninth Army, once a formidable force, vanished from the order of battle. It highlighted the enormous civilian cost of encirclement warfare in populated areas, and it reinforced the geopolitical reality that the Soviets would dominate Central and Eastern Germany at the war's end. The legacy of Halbe thus rests on three intertwined elements: the military destruction of an entire field army, the humanitarian tragedy of tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians killed in forests and villages, and the enduring memory of the battle as one of the final brutal acts of the Second World War in Europe.